I'll be adding nothing to the conversation by saying Resident Evil 4 is a seminal game that defined the genre, even till this day, and will probably continue to do so. A lot of great games have come from its legacy, but rather it's those from within its own series that are the most interesting to me. How do you follow up such a definitive experience? I mean, can you imagine being the developers of Resident Evil 5? Better yet, can you imagine being the developers of Resi 5 and not under the direction of Shinji Mikami? In a way, a game that made changes to a whole industry might have damaged those closest to it. There's an interior comparison to be made between this spiritual trilogy, which may reveal an interesting exterior context for the series as a whole at the time of these games' releases. This is all in the run-up to the release of the Resident Evil 2 remake, which looks to be a culmination of the series' history. Now for context, I went through the games in their HD re-release form on the PS4 in sequential order. I had played them all previously, and so I approached this reassessment of the games with the opinions and observations I had when I first played them still in mind. Surprisingly, upon my revisit, I've come to a massive amount of alteration in my initial opinions on these games, and I'll dot some of those original opinions throughout the videos where appropriate. But this will be a straightforward run through the games with cross-examinations and all kinds of back and forth comparisons to try and illustrate my points as best I can. So with that, let's start naturally with Leon Kennedy's foray into a non-specific Spanish village. Again, I have nothing new to say here when explaining that Resi 4 shaped the steps the series took towards action. The implementation of a third-person over-the-shoulder camera gave not only Resident Evil, but many other games a new perspective. This design decision is the crux of why Resi 4 plays still so solidly to this day. It simultaneously places precise control, yet enormous pressure on the player, because while you have the freedom to place your shots, you can't move. It shines in the village sequence, and it's a set piece that gives a nice lesson in how the combat revolves around picking the best lines of defense for yourself against the closing hordes of the Ganados. The basics of combat facilitates a core loop of tension that the game then toys with as it changes the environments and enemy types. Resi 4 has a great time slowly ratcheting up the demand from the player, with pacing that joyfully sweeps you through its kitsch characters and scenarios. I never intended to even play the game as much as I did. Initially I just bought it to fuck around with during Halloween, but by the time I had beaten the giant lake salamander, I knew I was going to carry on till the credits rolled. That's the power of a well-paced game. It gives you the peaks and troughs to effortlessly rollercoaster your way through it. Resi 4 splits itself into distinct sections with connecting intervals that merge the locations together. You start with the village, connected to the castle by cliffside environments and canyons, then make your way through the increasingly ridiculous layout of the castle, eventually boating over to a military island that leads into secret underground labs and other industrial sites. It creates the feeling you're moving through a continuous space, no matter the absurd geography of it all. Similar in a way to Half-Life 2, it really feels like you've come a long way by the end of it, because of how the game is structured, which is where the games after Resi 4 don't fare as well. Less so 5, which does a decent job at keeping the rolling pace from Resi 4 intact, only with less interesting or exciting scenarios. When I first played Resi 5, I really enjoyed it. I sunk a surprising amount of time into it back when it was initially released, and that opinion mostly holds up, although after playing its predecessor so close to it, the strands that don't quite come together reveal themselves. For example, most of the game's set pieces are structurally identical to those of 4. The opening village sequence is, well, the opening village sequence, only now there are more enemies on screen at once, and the level's a bit bigger. Which is what Resi 5's design philosophy seems to be throughout, doing what 4 did, but with more bad guys around, and this kind of gets a bit old before the game even reaches the halfway point. Even some of the visual beats are the same. You have the mines and military interiors you get in 4, alongside the village section I already mentioned. There's also the labs too. It makes the formula obvious when it's repeated like this. However, Resi 5 does have some of its own levels to distinguish itself a bit, and some of these do a nice job of opening up the design in a good way. My favourite being Chapter 3-1 in the marshlands, when you have access to a boat and multiple locations to bounce between in order to collect key items. There are also a few hidden extras off the main path, so it's a nice change of pace from this constant pushing you've been doing up until this point. These occasional open areas are also seen in 6, but rarely, maybe once per campaign, and instead they add more to the tedium than providing light options.
Damn it. We need 3 separate passcodes to get this open. Oh, fantastic.
This is exacerbated in the ones that take place in the tight confines of a ship, where you have to collect a bunch of items to progress, but within a maze of corridors rather than the wide lake area of 5. Not to mention, a section like the one I described in 6 will come up twice as you play through the same area again, but from the perspective of a different character. Double the tedium, which is where I can start to mention 6's biggest problems, the game's multiple campaigns. On paper, the idea of intersecting campaigns in a Resident Evil game could be another one if handled interestingly. We've seen elements of this in the different scenarios back in classic Resi games. Tying this to puzzles and changing levels based on your actions as one character to another could have worked. For example, you might play through an environment as Leon, solve a puzzle, then when exploring the same place later as Ava, the puzzles having been solved by Leon are no longer the challenge, but now the space is used for combat instead, which is about the only time the game actually does this in a decent way. Instead, most of the intersecting moments are just repeating a scenario you've already done, but from a slightly different perspective. And this bogs down each campaign with at least a good quarter to half of the levels being recycled zones. There might be some tweaks to how you approach them, or from what angle you're seeing them from, but either way, since you've experienced the set piece as a whole before, you're familiar with the beats of it already. There's no surprise. All in all, each character gets maybe 1 or 2 unique levels for themselves, like Leon's section at a university and the streets of Tall Oaks, or Jake and Sherry's escape from an umbrella facility, but most of the time you're repeating yourself and it gets old quick. This type of structuring also causes Resi 6 to lose the continuous pacing and progression seen in the games before it. It's noticeable, but hard to explain. Resi 6 feels more levelly, and what I mean by that is that each part feels like a sectioned off chapter rather than the continuous journey that 4 and 5 feel like. At first, I thought it might have been because of the breaks in between each part, separated by a ranking and upgrade screen, but 4 and 5 have these too. What it's possibly down to is the globe-trotting nature of the narrative itself. You're thrust from America to China in Leon's campaign, from Edonia to an unknown location in Jake's, and in Chris's you're sent back to Edonia via a flashback. Or maybe you're literally teleported back and forth in time because the new weapons you find, supposedly 6 months in the past, update themselves into your current day inventory. But that's a nitpick. The real point is that the fragmentation of the narratives, plus the interconnected pathways of them all, derail the game's structure and levels to be increasingly unsatisfying as you play. And you can play these in any order you choose, so the campaigns you tackle later will most likely come across as the most tedious, almost like Resi 6 is asking you to choose your own boredom. It was definitely the least engaging of all 3 structurally because of this. The games each have their own interactions on a fundamentally similar control scheme, over-the-shoulder shooting. 5 makes some slight tweaks. They're less tanky and rigid than 4's, with Chris being able to strafe sideways and have 360-degree control of the camera. It's a noticeably smooth adjustment, natural with it being a more modern game. The stop and shoot mechanics remain the same, although it never quite draws out the tension that it did in 4. It's hard to put a finger on why this is, but I'd consider it to be a part of the game's biggest change, the inclusion of co-op. Now that there's potentially 2 players pumping out twice the amount of lead, you've always got your back covered, and even if the maneuverability adjustments are slight, it feels easier to dodge enemies now, and the game arms you with a greater variety of guns, which creates the core gameplay distinction between it and 4, which retained one foot in the realm of survival horror by limiting your resources and moveset. 5, however, has both feet on the side of action. It just happens to play like Resi 4 did, but the fundamentals are different. It goes back to the increased number of enemies you deal with in 5. Set pieces have you gunning through hordes with little emphasis, but in 4, every enemy felt considered, felt like a threat. Set pieces felt more like violent puzzles that tested your prioritization and resource management, and as such, when the challenge ramps up, it always feels like you're making sacrifices and just scraping by. The real and only fear of death in 5 comes from the special enemies, most of which are again pasted over from Resident Evil 4, the chainsaw guy or the minigun guy for example. 5 finds the template laid out by 4 as hard to abandon. But something else it can't shake is how bad Sheva's AI is when she's not controlled by another person. She's constantly wasting healing items and placing herself in the worst positions. She's a detriment to a smooth single player experience. All Sheva really becomes is a glorified backpack to extend the tiny inventory space you have, except this backpack might occasionally use the items it carries when you don't want it to.
You grab it.
Roger.
So if you've got a mate, get them in so the game's less of a hassle. This is where I can throw some praise in the way of 6. The co-op is much less intrusive, there's no item management between you and your partner, and they're usually pretty competent in battle and stick to the script when it comes to some of the more intense combat scenarios, like when there's potential for you to die to a one-hit kill. As a side note, I appreciated the refinement to the camera placement for the co-op related actions in 6. It tends to find an interesting angle while you wait for your partner to help bust down a door or perform an action, and it's a lot better than the tracking that happens in 5. I can also say 6 fares competently as a shooter, the biggest control differences being that you can now move and shoot at the same time, and there are some evasive rolls and dive moves you can perform. These sometimes come in handy against bosses and the occasional enemy, but if Resi 5's movement was the tankier, less fluid cousin of Gears of War, then the maneuvers in 6 are the stiffer, less free-form relatives of the shoot-dodge moves from Max Payne. 6's actions are canned and awkward, occupying too much of a similar space on the controller. A lot of the time when I wanted to dive back, I'd just duck since it's tied to the same button, and other times my character would accidentally slide roll because that and aiming your gun are both tied to the left trigger. There's the occasional moment where it works, but I was mostly using it to make some of the standard combat encounters less boring and more goofy. And that's goofy in the less endearing sense, not in the knowing way. Resident Evil 4 waves its B-movie campiness around, hoping you'll surrender to its utter daftness, and it's refreshing. Especially now going back, it's fun to blast through a game that's expertly crafted, yet doesn't take itself too seriously. But what makes Resi 4 such a masterful balancing act is that the glee never undercuts the dread. The game remains genuinely gripping when you get down to brass tacks. No matter how stupid the story goes, you're grounded in that tough combat. 6 borders on achieving some of this knowingness, and it's about as strong as the game gets, both tonally and narratively. Leon shooting a zombified president, Chris's gruff soldier who's turned to booze after losing his squad, Jake being the only cure for the world, etc, etc. It just never quite has the game design prowess to coexist with, which is perhaps why I tried to play Resi 6 as goofy as possible. Like a torch running out of battery, there's occasional glimmers where it falls into place. Hunting and being hunted by a giant invisible snake is probably my favourite moment in the game. Fist fighting the Ustinak above lava is wicked, and RPGing a giant bee ain't too bad either. They're just not consistent enough moments to wash aside the rest of the mess alongside it. In terms of which campaign within 6 is the best, I'd say it's Chris's. Most would argue Leon's, but all it does is homage prior, better Resident Evil games, but it's not as well executed as what it's aping, and so rather than play something that is lying to you about what it is, I'll take the Chris story, with its full schlocky embrace of the B-movie action style and lack of substance any day. Moments like when Chris and Piers jump shouting from an exploding building exemplify this for me. What both 5 and 6 lack is a good set of villains. Simmons from 6 is as bland as the colour of his suit, and the clone of Ada never quite feels like a threat. Going back to 4, despite the silliness, the villains do pose as good adversaries, even if most of what they do is banter with Leon over the phone.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Sadler has that classic mastermind evil behind exuding calmness thing going on, which makes you wonder what the monstrous side will be once it's revealed. Salazar is an irritating toddler, but his castle is full of elaborate traps and his bodyguards are intimidating. The Predator-esque camera catching up to you through the sewer is genuinely scary, not to mention Krauser as an equal opponent to Leon. Even Resi 5, for its bland villains, had Wesker and his over-delivered dastardly evil plans, and he was physically imposing too. It's a shame that the rest of the bad guys are unremarkable and totally forgettable.
Mr. Redfield, how nice to finally make your acquaintance.
Who the hell are you?
Moreover, on the tonal and atmospheric side of Resident Evil 5, there aren't the kitsch elements seen in 4, nor the B-movie dopiness of 6. Instead, quite a straight, po-faced plot about bioterrorism in a developing country. There's no inching towards the self-aware, but some might like how 5 takes Resident Evil and its lore a bit more seriously. I wouldn't say it harms the game, but it certainly doesn't allow for much experimentation. As a result, the events of Resi 5 feel a little forgettable, the villains beside Wesker feasible but unremarkable. And without the atmospheric development and playfulness Leon goes through, Chris's outing all sort of blends into one. On my replay, I even forgot about some sections of the game, because they all kind of feel ubiquitous visually and tonally. For its abundance of camp, Resi 4 still stuck you in a lab with a regenerator alongside the bombast for some scares. The timed elevator sequence, surviving against the aggressive Verdungo, is tense, and these moments add to the varying pace of 4, not just from a gameplay perspective, but an emotional one. You'll be clutching at trying to survive 1 minute and smiling in catharsis the next. 5 tries its hand at horror with brief sections including lickers, but they aren't as intimidating as they might seem, and in fact you can avoid them in most cases, or once you're kitted out, hold your ground and mow them all down. There's not many sequences where Resi 5 wants to slow down or give you something tonally new to chew on. Again, it manages to maintain a consistency, but at the cost of an overall chartable experience of highs and lows. With Resi 6, it's clear that fragmented between each campaign are little pieces that could form the whole of a tonally balanced and decently put together game. The production values certainly won't leave you with any doubts. The game still holds up visually, and the cutscenes are well produced, and overall it's a well animated and polished action experience. It's just overstretched and unfocused, which sets it as the weakest of all 3. Aside from the shortcomings I mentioned earlier, I think Resident Evil 5 excels in its replay value. This is where you can surpass the false pretense an initial playthrough tries to serve you, that you're weak, vulnerable and lacking in resources. When the same game has Chris punch a boulder with his big fuck off muscles, you realise that pretense is bollocks. Resi 5 is actually a classic power fantasy, and upon replaying it you can truly tap into mentality that's most fun to tackle the game in, and that's nailing down perfect runs in each level, speedrunning in the game, unlocking the secret weapons, infinite ammo, alternate costumes and gearing up to try and beat professional mode. 5 carries your items and data across difficulties and over the entire game, so you can go back to the earlier parts you might have scraped by on your first playthrough and unleash carnage with the most powerful stuff in the game. It's more open and freeing than 4 in this regard, in a way sort of democratizing metagame elements to any player, and so the game is much more satisfying here. The upgrades and progression are also miles ahead of its sequel. 6 feels impersonal and cold when you're presented with an upgrade screen of rather uninteresting stat adjustments. Even though 5 lacks the charismatic merchant of 4, same as 6, it still stands above the latter with its upgradable weapons, unlockable costumes and extras. There's more character to it and is thus more encouraging to explore. 4 has its attempts to hook you back in. You unlock a couple alternate costumes and some new weapons, but they're only available on a save that continues the same difficulty you've already played. The game unlocks professional after you beat it, but since you can't carry over your gear, it's perhaps less incentivizing a prospect than it is in 5, unless you're going for the achievement or trophy. I did give the game a second whack on professional, and it's a tough time. You take a lot more damage, and the adaptive difficulty of the game, where items and enemies change behaviours based on how well you're doing, is kept at the max and doesn't drop, so the Ganados are always accurate and more often aggressive than not. One little trick I found in this mode is using the Special 2 outfit to your advantage, as Ashley becomes invincible and too heavy for the baddies to kidnap her, since she's wearing knight's armour. With this you can basically set her up as a defense point to aggro threats away from you, mopping up loose enemies while others try and attack her. Use her as cover from ranged attacks, or even let enemies try and grab her and then fall down for a free knifing opportunity to save ammo. It's a funny little way of playing that changed my tactics, intentional or not. I had a laugh with it. Which is all more than I can say for 6, which I had no draw to replay or stick with. It was already tiresome just to finish off the final campaign that it already outstayed its welcome. There are some extras to unlock, but for me, they're not as immediately gratifying as the stuff in 4 and 5, and so I found myself uninstalling the game pretty quickly. Overall, there's a separation between the 3 games that, if considered a spiritual trilogy, provide some of the most distinct developments between sequels that I've ever played. If you were to consider Gears of War as an example of an action franchise, each game is iterative in small ways, whereas between these 3 Resi games, each one is distinct. While the design gap between 4 and 5 is smaller than the jump to 6, 5 is perhaps the standout in delving aside from the camp B-movie silliness and carves an atmosphere of its own, whereas 6 makes bigger leaps to changing the campaign structure and movement mechanics of its prequels. 4 is obviously the foundation and has an almost default prestige for it being the game that defines this phase of the series. But if we return to the question, how did the developers follow on from Resident Evil 4, looking at the games in retrospect, one attempt remains perhaps too similar and the other strayed too far, but there's perhaps further context for why this is. Upon reflection, now in 2019, It's clear to see games like Dead Space and Alan Wake as truer successors to Resident Evil 4 in the 7th generation of consoles. As such, the series was unique in its struggle, since it not only needed to follow up on its namesake, but also compete with other games alongside it that were doing the same, i.e. building from Resident Evil 4's trend-setting foundation. Therefore, it might be easier to comprehend the series' identity crisis, as it couldn't just rely on replicating 4 wholesale, indicated by reception of Resi 5 at the time, as a good game, but notably as also a bit of a reskin, as I've laid out here as well. So the series then had to wrestle with itself and its competition in trying to figure out where it was best for it to go against the myriad of successful games that also followed on from the legacy of Resi 4. Bar the original Dead Space, the majority of those games were taking away inspiration for how to craft action rather than a survival horror experience. The influence of this on 6 was given away by the fracturing of its campaigns. They all feel a bit like other action games surrounding it at the time, to its downfall. However, in a weird cyclical way, the increasing distance from horror seen in the 7th gen led to a resurgence of horror within the indie scene with games like Amnesia. Trace that resurgence out of the indie scene and straight to Resident Evil 7, and to some respect, the series' own previous failures led the way for it to get back up onto its own feet. The trilogy of 4, 5 and 6 make up a natural self-contained narrative of subtle evolution, representative of a broader context of genre mutation in response to a changing landscape, and how that can both backfire and produce success. But with the praise given to 7 and the upcoming release of the RE2 remake, Capcom looks to be taking lessons from the trilogy mentioned here and is choosing to look inward to move forward rather than outwards, taking the stylings of Resi 4 and applying it to the series' distinct genre premise. Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6 represent the trajectory for this to happen.
Jesus Christ.